Hello, it's May 2nd, and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have journalist and reporter Assiah Hamed.
Hello.
And down the line from Beirut, Lebanon, is the New Arab's international correspondent editor, Yazan Al-Saadi.
Hello. Happy to be here.
What's that coming over the hill? It's the news. On with the show. Assiah, our first story is from you. What have you got for us?
So, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, is preparing warrants for senior government officials in what would be the most serious international legal action taken against Israel since the Gaza war erupted in October. The ICC, which can charge individuals with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, is investigating Hamas's October 7 cross-border attack and Israel's devastating military assault in Gaza, now in its 7th month.
On the Israeli side, I think that's been sort of the main development this week in the story. Who is threatened by these international arrest warrants?
So we are looking potentially to see, reportedly, arrest warrants for senior Israeli military and political officials. So that means this includes Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on charges related to the war in Gaza, according to reports from Israeli and international media. We also have other Israeli medias that are rumored to be facing warrants, and that also includes Army Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. So, and also on the Hamas side, it's also likely that you'll see Hamas leaders such as Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar among the Hamas leaders also potentially facing arrest warrants.
The ICC doesn't normally deal with, shoplifting and petty vandalism. I'm guessing these are pretty serious crimes. So what would the actual charges? What do we think they could be charged with?
So, in fact, the ICC has been looking into possible war crimes committed by Israel since 2021. So, and there's also at the same time, the court has also been investigating similar accusations leveled against Hamas fighters. And then you also have to consider investigations that have been ongoing regarding acts of violence committed by Israeli settlers in the West Bank. And then there's the recent developments in the war that's all being considered in the context. So, that would also be a potential consideration for what the charges would look like, because ultimately there's the recent conflict into with October 7th and all the events that have transpired, where with October 7th some 1,200 people have been killed by Hamas fighters, and because of the Israeli offensive, we're looking at over 34,000 Palestinians who have been killed, mostly women and children.
I mean, we obviously don't know if warrants are going to be issued. It seems like they are coming down the pipeline. Let's say they do happen. What does then happen? I mean, are we going to get ICC policemen turning up in Jerusalem and him being dragged out of his bedroom in his pajamas in the middle of the night?
Well, typically in terms of how ICC arrest warrants will basically happen is through a 3-judge pretrial chamber of the ICC, and they have to persuade the pretrial chamber that there are reasonable grounds to believe that a suspect has committed a crime and that the arrest of the person is necessary, and that necessity includes cases where the arrest is needed to ensure the person's appearance at trial. So obtaining those kind of warrants isn't just through seeking bench warrants, for example, from a district or county court. There'll have to be a hearing first, and through that evidence will kind of give judges time to deliberate on whether action needs to be taken for those arrest warrants to take place. So there has to be a court hearing prior to those arrests to take place, before everything might happen. So that is the extent of what we know in terms of how those ICC arrest warrants typically happen.
So a hearing into a hearing, I think, is that what we're saying? Sort of. I mean, even if they do get issued, then nothing's going to happen soon.
Yes, in short.
I'm going to have a guess and say that the US is probably not keen on this news.
You've guessed right.
Yeah, what are they saying and what are they doing?
So, reportedly, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Netanyahu's raised the issue over a phone call with President Biden over the weekend. And they've not been been verified and confirmed by the White House. However, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre did say in a recent briefing that they've been really...
So we've been really clear about the ICC investigation. We do not support it. We don't believe that they have the jurisdiction. And I'm just going to leave it there for now.
At the same time, Jean-Pierre didn't confirm any of the reports by Axios that Netanyahu did ask Biden about preventing the court from sending out warrants for Israeli officials. And she just stated that their primary focus is to get the hostage deal sorted and getting a ceasefire and getting humanitarian aid into Gaza. And she declined to comment that Washington also reached out to the ICC directly to warn that the issuing of any warrants could derail moves to reach the ceasefire and hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. Definitely said that they don't have the jurisdiction.
No, more on that, I think, a ceasefire later. I think probably unsurprising the US isn't going wild about this. I'm guessing there are people who do want this, though. Out there, who we say would we think is supporting these warrants, maybe even asking for them directly?
Yeah, so we have Russia, who did say on Tuesday that the US was being hypocritical by opposing the ICC's investigation, reported investigation of Israel.
Russia are paragons of international law.
Of course, Russia, of course. And they said that obviously this was hypocritical because the US supported, of course, as we know, the court's warrant for the arrest of Putin. And Russia said that have reiterated that the warrants against Putin has been a meaningless attempt by the West to soil Russia's reputation. And of course, they've consistently denied war crimes in Ukraine. And their spokesperson said in a post that the U.S. political system doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the structure. And just thought that their position ultimately was absurd. So they've obviously called out the US for, double standards.
Yeah. Pot calling kettle black there. The Israel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember Israel ever being a signatory to the ICC. So, how does that work? I mean, does the ICC even have jurisdiction in Israel over this conflict?
Well, you are right. So while Israel isn't a signatory to the ICC, in fact, because Palestine, the Palestinian occupied territories, have been they basically have been recognized as a member state. So therefore, essentially, in short, the ICC believes that they do have jurisdiction. And essentially, anyway, in general, like anyone issued with an arrest warrant would be unable to travel to more than 120 countries that are members of the ICC, including most European countries, or they could be detained. So if arrest warrants were issued against Israeli officials, some allied countries could take action such as reducing weapons transfers or scaling back diplomatic visits, increasing Israel's international isolation, which I don't think they'll be pleased about that.
No, probably not. I mean, so best case scenario, it could be a step towards ending arms exports to Israel.
Yes.
Maybe at least it would stop Netanyahu's shopping sprees in Paris. Yazan, you got a question?
I have a comment and a question. So I just wanted to add that this question of jurisdiction, just because Israel is not a signature of the convention, Russia isn't a signature of the convention. They had pulled out in 2014 or 2016. So the question of jurisdiction, I think, is moot. We've seen in precedent that it doesn't really matter. We're talking about international law, human rights, very basic things that are applicable to states and non-states, regardless if they're signatures of these conventions. We're talking about things like war crimes, genocide, it doesn't matter if you sign on to these things.
Yeah.
It matters from a human perspective, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
in
very
general, it's I think this is part of the larger debate about the ICC and double standards, right? Rarely, if ever, or there hasn't been a Western leader or a leader that is firmly in the Western pocket per se that has been held accountable by the ICC.
Yeah.
And it's part of the arguments about that, right?
I mean, I think I may be wrong, but I also don't think I'm a long way off. I think it's been one person has been found guilty at the ICC.
No, it's been multiple, and it's been mainly African leaders, right?
It's been. I mean, for the length of the court, it's been a handful, though.
It's been a handful because the court is recent, right? Like the court and its structures is quite a recent phenomenon. It's very slow, right?
Very, very slow.
Very slow. But more often than not, the handful of cases are either African leaders. So that's why the ICC in Africa, the African continent, has such a negative connotation because it seems to be used directly against, just their leaders and not Western leaders, right? And we've seen this replicated in many instances. So this leads to the larger question, right? If the ICC is unable to release arrest warrants to Israeli officials like they did with Russian officials over the Ukrainian war, how will this further erode trust in international law and institutions worldwide? And I think this is the core question we're all asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I feel like this also, I mean, as much as we have to obviously distinguish the differences between the ICJ and ICC, you see those parallels because you see that with what's been happening with South Africa's case at the ICJ, and obviously they've made claims about Israel causing genocide and its brutal military offensive in Gaza. And, on one hand, as much as, the ICJ did claim that, that they were at risk, Palestinians were at risk of genocide. However, there wasn't that emergency motion put in place, made by South Africa in order, to
actually stop the fighting.
Yeah, exactly, to seize all military operations. So it just, there definitely is a point to be made in terms of the fact that, there isn't international law that's, pressing enough in order to, see in terms of the severity of the operations. And I think, it just also poses the questions about, these courts' legitimacy. And maybe also in the case of how the U.S. has also corroborated Israeli claims and said, that they don't want to continue forth and supporting these arrests, and people would obviously argue that it's American hypocrisy, and there's a lot to say.
Yazan,
briefly, I think ultimately what we're looking at, in my view, is the erosion of the post-World War II order. A lot of the structures and norms and rules in international law are collapsing in the face of reality, right? Power dynamics are changing. Positions and politics are changing. We also have to remember, and I studied international law in SOAS, international law in its onset, when it was first conceived, was law of empire. It's about empire building. And I think this is the root foundational problem in international law. In its own inception, it wasn't really created by international jurisprudence or thinkers worldwide. It was created by the Western institutions for Western empire building that slowly expanded internationally in the post-World War II situation. And that's why there's a lot of gaps. There's gaps about accountability. There's gaps about refugeehood, for example. Yeah. There's gaps about rights. There's gaps about non-statehood. There are so many problems. Yeah. And I think ultimately all this, we're facing a very, dire 21st century. And one of the big questions we need to ask ourselves is, how can we truly form, maybe this is an opportunity for us to truly form a type of international law and institutions that is truly international and centers humanity, right? The progression of human beings, not just states and empires. And I think this is the larger thought.
I would say that I think this is, considering how long people have been trying to get Israel and Palestine on the docket at the ICC, and it's been resisted by countless ICC chief prosecutors. I think this is a good step forward. Second story this week is from me. It's been ongoing, really, but Rafah is on everybody's minds. On April 30th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reiterated his promise that Israeli forces will launch an assault on Gaza, claiming that they have no other choice. His comments further increased fears of huge civilian casualties. On April 30th, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke with reporters and said this.
Recent weeks have seen airstrikes on the Rafah area. A military assault on Rafah would be an unbearable escalation, killing thousands more civilians and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee.
I have a question. What are the Israelis planning to do?
They're planning to do what they've always been doing and continuing with this plan to eliminate Hamas and also free hostages. There are, by the estimates of Israeli officials, Hamas have 6 battalions remaining in the Gaza Strip, 4 of which are in the southern city of Rafah. Going to carry on with their plan, total, quote-unquote, total victory, and eliminate Hamas and try and free the hostages.
And I wanted to ask, so what has the international community said, apart from the US?
President Abbas has called on the United States mainly to stop the attack on Rafah. He said, quote, "We call on the United States of America to ask Israel not to carry out the attack on Rafah." He said that America is the only country capable of preventing Israel from committing this crime, which he said at the World Economic Forum in the Saudi capital of Riyadh. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she said it would be completely unacceptable for Israel to attack Rafah. She was asked whether an Israeli assault on the southern city of Gaza on the southern Gazan city would sort of constitute a red line for the EU in terms of Israeli actions, which then, could result in sanctions, EU sanctions against Israel. She said, quote, "I am never drawing red lines, but I think it would be completely unacceptable if Netanyahu would invade." Notably, one of the most prominent voices to be against this has come from the US, and particularly Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who reiterated US opposition to an Israeli assault on Rafah. He said this on Wednesday in talks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He also added that such a move would severely harm US efforts to secure a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Whether that's going to happen or not is, I think, unlikely anyway.
So in general, from what you've read, is there any hope for the civilians getting out?
In short, no. There's currently over 1.4 million civilians in Rafah. There's not enough food. There's not enough water. I think this week it was reported there's no clean water now in Gaza. There's not enough aid. There's not enough medical supplies. I mean, the situation is incredibly dire. A plan was put forward by the Israeli military. This was reported on April 26th to the War Cabinet that said that the Israeli military would move people from Rafah to other areas of Gaza to allow this assault to happen. Now, to move, what would probably likely be over 1 million people would be a massive effort. Israel reckons it can do it in a few weeks. The US strongly disagrees and says it's more likely to take months. Either way, even when they do manage to move people, those people will not have food, they still won't have water, they still won't have medical supplies, and they still won't have the right proper aid or shelter or anything like this. If they stay in Rafah, they risk being bombed by Israeli military and attacked by the Israeli military and killed. If they leave, they also risk being attacked by the Israeli military. So the situation is really a lose-lose, unfortunately, for the people of Gaza.
So I wanted to also ask, so who is then exactly calling for the assault?
I mean, Netanyahu right at the top. He has said that the Israeli military will attack Rafah with or without a ceasefire deal, which is quite a serious statement to make. behind him, you have two names which I'm sure you've heard before. Bezalel Smotrich, who's a finance minister. He has come out forward and said it was at a Passover event. He called for the total obliteration of Rafah. He said, quote, Rafah, Deir al-Balah and Nurasat, total annihilation. You'll blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. There's no place under heaven. Amalek is a reference to Deuteronomy from the Jewish Torah. Worth noting that both Deir al-Balah and Nurasat are refugee camps in the Gaza Strip, and that's what he wants to annihilate. Other people, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, he's come out and said the Israeli military should go into Rafah. He's also threatened to bring down the government if there isn't an assault on Rafah. The current Netanyahu government relies on the support of both Smotrich and Ben-Gvir to stay in power. Without them, his Israeli government would collapse. Ben-Gvir actually skipped a cabinet meeting on Tuesday in order to meet with his religious Zionism faction to talk about the disagreement over the Rafah assault.
So that all sounds pretty intense. There is a talk of a truce and a deal. So what is in the deal? What's going on with that?
The two sides have been talking through intermediaries during April, which have all sort of come to a head now. The talks have been mediated, but in Cairo by Qatar and the US. The deal that has essentially been put forward would allow for a 40-day ceasefire in exchange for the release of captives held in Gaza by Hamas, and also the release of Palestinian prisoners. Initially, there were reports coming out saying that Hamas were all right with the deal. Now they're coming out saying they're not. Senior official Assiah Hamed told AFP late on Wednesday, that's yesterday as we record, that the movement's position on the truce proposal was, quote, negative, but that for the time being discussions were still underway. I think the main sticking point is that Hamas want a permanent ceasefire, and Israel has consistently rejected that idea.
Yeah, building on that, I think a lot from what you hear from at least the Palestinian side is how there are 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza that are in effect, captives, right, in concentration camps. And there's over 10,000 Palestinian prisoners within Israel that is mainly taken from the West Bank. So considering all of this, right, and the fact that Netanyahu has declared that there will be an attack on Rafah, regardless if a deal is made with Hamas for a ceasefire, 40 days or whatnot, what is the point of negotiations anyhow?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's sort of like the sticking point that Hamas have got themselves to. The way they're looking at it is that they could create a deal, they could exchange hostages, they could get Palestinians out of prisons, and they could get their 40 days, and Israel could still attack after that 40 days. I mean, a ceasefire deal is not a deal if one side doesn't follow the terms of the deal as well. From the Israeli side, I think that what the idea is they create a deal that is incredibly unpalatable for Hamas, right? Which is essentially, we'll give you 40 days, but after that, we're still going to attack. So then what's the point of Hamas going through with a deal? This is good for Israel. I think they believe this is good for Israel because it means that when Hamas come through and say, potentially say, screw this, we're not interested in this deal, it's terrible. Both Israel, the US, I mean, even the EU, to a greater extent, probably the UK, can go forward and say, we tried to get a deal, and Hamas threw it back in our face. This is all on them, and then everything that follows in Rafah, that's all their fault. Whereas the deal was, bad to begin with, and an assault on Rafah was such an inevitability. I think that's where Hamas finds themselves at the moment. I think Netanyahu has problems as well. He said that there's going to be an assault on Rafah no matter what, but he's also dealing with domestic problems by where there's now a lot of people on the Israeli street saying, we need to get the hostages back. It's been a long time now for them. They want to get the hostages back, and they are saying, let's deal with Hamas. Any deal with Hamas risks bringing down the Netanyahu government, because the likes of Smotrich and Ben Gvir will not accept any deal with Hamas, and as a result will bring down the Netanyahu government. Any deal that brings down the Netanyahu government risks seeing Netanyahu in court when he's out of office on corruption charges, which is something he doesn't want to see either. Final story this week comes from you, Yazan. What have you got for us?
Yes, indeed. So this past Saturday, April 28th, the Iraqi parliament passed a bill titled The Law on Combating Prostitution and Homosexuality that explicitly criminalizes same-sex relationships in a move that Iraqi lawmakers claim aims to protect Iraqi society from moral depravity. The bill's passing naturally triggered a wave of criticism from various local and international human rights organizations, including half-hearted criticisms from officials from the West, mainly the US and UK. Interestingly enough, this passing of the bill came after a meeting between Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani with US President Joe Biden about 2 weeks ago to discuss a range of issues between the two countries.
Just maybe a bit of context here. Yeah. What was the deal for homosexuality in Iraq before this law? Was it pride marches every other week, or were they sort of very much hidden for their own safety?
In general, the queer community's condition in Iraq prior to this bill was dangerous and precarious. And this bill, this law now only furthers the danger they are facing as, a vulnerable, marginalized community. Prior to this law, the queer community was often discriminated against. They were discriminated against subtly via the penal code through morality clauses, often under the terms of adultery, because it's very archaic, right?
Yeah.
And we can talk about a bit why later. And at the same time, they're attacked by members of society, right? Militias and other groups, and even the Iraqi police. And rarely, if ever, is anyone held accountable to harassment, killings, sexual assaults. So it's a horrible experience already, and this furthers the danger for this community.
Who's pushing the bill forward?
Well, this particular law was pushed mainly by the conservative Shia parties that have the largest coalition in the parliament, but it's also backed by virtually all the parties, regardless of sect, Kurds, Sunnis, and others, right? So this has a backing that is quite unanimous within the political sphere.
I follow Iraq. I see it on the news. I read articles and things, and they've got some pretty serious problems in Iraq. And I never read, maybe I missed it, but I never saw the article about Iraq's homosexual community, tanking the economy. So surely there are more important things in the country to worry about than this for Iraqi lawmakers.
Oh, you would think so. Iraqi lawmakers and officials basically are arguing that this upholds societal values and it's pushing back against Western interference, in which both cases or both claims, I think, aren't very accurate or true. Why is this happening now? I mean, we have to realize the context, right? There, over the past couple of years, has been a regional wave of anti-queer sentiment that we see from Iraq to Morocco, from Syria, Lebanon, down to Saudi Arabia, where they would ban things like, rainbow colors or anything to do that. I think, personally, this is a form of scapegoating by the authorities away from the issues, right? Like
Yeah.
whether it's corruption, repression, freedom of expression, and so on. I think there's also another dynamic that's been at play in the region when it comes to the question of the queer community that has been ongoing for over a century. And people forget, and ironically, when the Iraqi officials talk about, pushing back against Western interference, that the very laws and penal codes in these countries that are in use were taken and influenced and shaped by colonialism. We're talking about Napoleonic codes that really drive anti-sodomy laws. We're talking about, the absorption of Victorian Puritanian social morals that existed in the late 19th century that slowly got absorbed. So it's ironic, I think, the claim. And at the same time, there is this reactionary trend that often explodes in societies that experience occupation and invasion and colonialism, right? Reactionary forces just feed off the chaos and often regress societies, I think. So there's something larger at work here.
Obviously, political parties and political leaders seem all pretty G'd up for this and pretty keen on it. Is there popular support in the country for us?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is popular support, and that is driven again by a lot of ignorance on the question of what is queerness and the queer community. And like I said, it's nurtured by reactionary forces in chaotic times, right? And this is quite true throughout, not just in Iraq, but the entire region. People forget that same-sex relations and the queer community is not a foreign invasion or a foreign invention. This has existed in our societies as normal as any heterosexual person. And we need to have a conversation about that. We need to have an honest conversation, but we're not allowed to have honest conversations about this because of the reactionary forces. So in Iraq's case, you have major religious parties, right? And you have old nationalist parties that have the machismo style that exists in Latin America. So they will not talk about these things fairly, and they will often go to these communities and other marginalized communities because, they don't want to be the targets of the problems in society. And when they should be, because they are a lot of the reasons why there are these problems.
Sadly we have this law now. What are the punishments now for those found to be guilty of love?
Interestingly, initially the first version of this bill that was, put out earlier this year had the death penalty, which was horrible, right? People could have been sentenced to death, but that was dropped by an opposition of U.S. and European nations that were pressured by international NGO and local groups to push back against the initial version of the bill. Now this is the second version, and they've removed the clause on the death penalty, but the punishment ranges from a minimum of 10 years sentence to a maximum of 15 years for those caught in the act. And this is directed towards same-sex relations. There's also punishment against transition, if a person transitions from their gender biologically, or if they're cross-dressing. This is mainly heterosexual people that cross-dress. So it's a general attack on what, quote unquote, is called sexual deviancy. And even if you can be fined for promoting sexual deviancy or advocating, for it, and the fine is no less than $7,600 US, which is about 10 million Iraqi dinars, and that is a lot of money.
For anybody, that's a lot of money.
For anyone, especially in Iraq, right? That's facing an economic collapse after the invasion and occupation. It's interesting, this argument of sexual deviancy, right? This idea of what is normal, as dictated by people who I don't think act normally. You know what I mean?
You mentioned it earlier. Iraqi Prime Minister was in Washington for a meeting with the US. Were they just talking about sexual deviancy, or do they have other things to talk about?
No, Joe Biden was busy talking about a range of issues with Sudani. So they met on April 15th. And the key issues they were talking about was fears of spillover from the Gaza war because the U.S. supports Israel. There are fears that, the U.S. bases are under threat in both Syria and Iraq. There is the larger question of the U.S. military presence in the country. There are about 2,500 troops that are spread around three major bases. There are questions of economic reforms, particularly sanctions on certain aspects of Iraq's economy and fears of any money going to the US's arch nemesis, Iran. So sexual rights is the last thing Joe Biden really cared to talk about, and human rights in general, I would say.
So there's no sort of threat that this is, this new law will interfere with U.S.-Iraqi relations then?
No, I don't think so.
This won't be the hill that Joe Biden dies on.
No, and it's never the hill, honestly, for any Western or countries when they make deals, or if there are interests with, the global South countries. The last thing they care about is anyone's life, and we've seen it in plenty of examples, right?
Yeah. As you mentioned, the US has a number of bases in Iraq. It has its ongoing support for Israel. Iraq has, particularly amongst the population, has a pretty intense support for Palestine. And there's increased threat now more than ever of Iranian-backed groups in Iraq attacking US bases. Are we getting to a point now where US bases in Iraq are quite untenable and perhaps more hassle than they're worth? Can they stick around, the US?
Think that question is really linked to the general point of the decline of the quote-unquote US empire that we're witnessing, right? And we are in the midst of this decline for many reasons. The US today, 2024, is not the US from the 1950s or even the 1990s or the US from the 2000s. So a lot is happening that is challenging what it can do, particularly politically, economically, and even militarily, I think. So inevitably, these bases will go. This is inevitable. Like all empires, there is a timeline. There is a life cycle. And I would argue that the life cycle of empires is speeding up the further, technology and societies are changing. So the quote-unquote US empire that really has invested in military bases throughout the region, right? Like we're not only looking at Iraq, we're looking at, in Qatar, which has the largest US base, in Bahrain, which is the larger naval base. You have two bases in Syria. You have a couple bases in Jordan, but the Jordanians don't like to talk about, and obviously Israel. But all these things, I think, are slowly going to erode. And a lot of this will be the challenges of other powers, particularly China, I think, is the biggest threat for the US, and they know it. It's why a lot of material and resources are trying to go around China.
Yep.
So inevitably, yes. Now, while you said that there is public support to kick the US out, this is true. The Iraqi politicians are half-hearted because they need the US for their survival. So let's see the tension within that, I think, would be interesting.
An exciting time to be alive.
Always, isn't it? It's great to be a journalist.
Yeah, news never stops.
Oh my God, yeah.
A few other stories from the week. One here from our Lebanon correspondent, Will Christou. Syrian regime sends military reinforcements to Sueda. The Syrian regime sent military reinforcements to the southern Syrian province of Sueda over the weekend, prompting fears that it would crack down on a 9-month-long protest movement there. Are these a genuine threat to Assad and his rule? And is that why he's sending the troops down now? Or is there other reasons? Yazan.
Yeah, so I do think that the very existence of a protest is a natural threat to any totalitarian system, and this regime is a totalitarian system. So their mere existence of people going out and expressing themselves on political or social issues is making, the regime weary. And it's the only place, if you realize, where there are protests outside of the narrative of the government, even on stuff like Palestine, right? The only place where one can freely protest for Gaza is ironically in Idlib and Sweda. People have tried to protest for Gaza in Damascus, but if they aren't under the control of the regime, they're promptly arrested and disappeared. So in effect, yes, the very existence of any protest, no matter how small, scares a totalitarian system, and this regime is definitely one of them.
We did an episode on the protests in Sweden a few months back now on the New Arab Voice. You can go back and listen to that. Another story here. China says Hamas Fatah made encouraging progress in talks. Representatives of rival Palestinian groups Hamas and Fatah made, quote, encouraging progress in recent talks in the Chinese capital on promoting reconciliation, China's foreign ministry said Tuesday. China has a bit of a track record when it comes to bringing together rivals. It brought together Iran and Saudi Arabia only a few months back. Can they do their diplomatic magic again, do we think, Assiah?
Well, historically, we've seen how China and Palestine have had, cordial relations. We saw that, I believe, in the last month where they met in Moscow for discussions about creating a Palestinian state and creating a unified Palestine. So we've seen, how China has continually attempted to make those efforts. However, if whether that's going to happen, considering Fatah and Hamas's strained ties is something that we just have to wait and to see how it unfolds. But this is not surprising considering China's relations with Palestine for several years.
Final story here: Abu Dhabi-backed group ends Telegraph takeover bid. An Abu Dhabi-backed group planning to take over British Telegraph Media Group said Tuesday will withdraw and sell on the business after the UK government moved to block the deal. A great day for British journalism, do we think, or are we sad to see the Emirates leave?
I think it goes either way. I mean, British journalism has took a lot of beating the last 7 months in terms of its integrity. Meanwhile, Emirati journalism isn't the best in the world. So I think for the audience, it's sort of, who knows, a shrug in the air. Perhaps this is protecting, British nationalism in the face of foreign dominance, foreign corporate dominance, and perhaps not. But I would say that overall, in general, if we're going to make something meaningful about this, I think this should be a larger conversation on who owns the media, and perhaps it should be the people, the masses, perhaps.
I look forward to your glorious revolution.
Me too.
A lot of good stuff on the New Arab's website this week.
My pick of the week is an opinion piece by Richard Sudan, and the title is how Black people globally are demanding reparations. It's time politicians listen. So I highly recommend our listeners to give it a read, and it's all about Richard Sudan's opinions on demanding reparations to atone for slavery, and just his overall discussions on structural racism, especially in the wake of the unjust killing of George Floyd. So that's my pick of the week.
Excellent. Well worth a read. Yazan, what have you got for us?
So I've got something from the opinion desk as well, from the perspectives section. This is an article titled, "Google Fired Me from Standing Against Tech Complicity in Gaza's Genocide, but Justice Cannot Be Stopped." This is by Mohammed Khatami. He used to be an employee in Google, and he was part of the movement to try and stop Google and other tech companies working on Project Nimbus, which is sort of a cloud system that allows Israel access, particularly data management And it's the worry here is that this technology is enabling Israel's military actions and genocidal moves in Gaza. And this person, with others, tried to do a protest and got fired for it. And I think this should worry all of us. Definitely makes us think about the nature of our technology and how it's being used in very repressive and nefarious means.
To push the podcast, the New Arab Voice podcast once again, we also did an episode on this that I think is well worth a listen. For me, I picked out a piece from the analysis desk by Giorgio Caferio, Why Qatar is the go-to mediator in the Gaza war and beyond. An interesting piece all about Gaza's diplomatic role in this war and others. All of those stories well worth a read. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by international correspondence editor Yazan Al-Saadi and journalist and reporter Assiah Hamed. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. Our other podcast, The New Arab Voice, is taking a break for the time being, but we'll be back with new episodes shortly. You can subscribe to The New Arab Voice and this podcast, The New Arab Weekly, on Apple, Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts, and be notified for when a new episode drops. Until then, if you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com, or find us on social media at TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.